What does it mean to make a difference? I thought I was going to make a difference when I joined the Union military. Dozens of star systems, hundreds of colonies, billions of people who relied on the United Armed Forces to defend them. I signed my life away to the recruiter and I headed straight for the pilot training academy because fighter pilots were the best of the best. Only a few ever made it, but they got the hardest missions, the most important ones. I wanted to be one of the few who made a difference. 3 years, and thousands of hours of flight time with just the hood of my cockpit between me and the void. It took me a while to start thinking in 3 dimensions, to get used to an environment where momentum mattered more than acceleration, and you had to have a 360-degree view because you could never, ever hear your enemy coming. I adjusted eventually. A lot didn't. You grow up with things like air and gravity. It's easy to forget they don't matter out there, in the black. And some people just couldn't handle the nothingness. A single-person fighter can be like a sensory deprivation pod sometimes. They only sent the recruits with the most potential to the academy, and maybe 10% of those made it as far as the written exams. In the infantry, they pride themselves on their physical fitness. Their recruits are made to work out until their muscles burn, and to run until they throw up. Our exams were the mental equivalent of that. We'd been preparing for them for years, and still only half the cadets who sat them passed. I made it. I got through the pilot school, and the combat training, and the endless studying, tutoring, and exams. I was one of the success stories. I was one of the few. I thought that meant I was one of the best. Better than the cadets who hadn't made it, certainly, and all the graduates from the less rigorous officer schools. Better than regular people? You know, I don't even remember thinking about them at that point. I'd joined up to defend the citizens of the Union, but by the time I finished training, my whole universe was the United Armed Forces. That was the point of military training, after all. They made a brand new squadron for us. Things had been quiet in the few years before I graduated. A few frontier skirmishes, but the attrition rate for fighter pilots was at its lowest in decades. We were more likely to get killed in a bar fight. So although a handful of my graduating class was sent off to fill the gaps in the rest of the fleet, they decided to keep the rest of us together. They decided to give us the shiniest new ships as well, rather than sticking us with the old Star Spears. The logic for that was that although we didn't have real combat experience, we also hadn't built up any bad habits that the more veteran pilots might have picked up. So they gave us the Void Sabres, the next generation of fighters, the most advanced craft the Union had ever built. Their designers were eager to show the UAF what they could do, and they wanted to start with a blank slate. No crotchety veterans complaining that their control panel was confusing, and their old ships did this or that better. They wanted pilots they could mould to their ships, rather than the other way around. And we were as mouldable as putty. That was the point of military training, after all. The 121st Squadron, or Raven Squadron, as they called us, on account of the black-on-black markings of the Void Sabres, only visible in infrared. 50 of us young lieutenants, fresh out of the academy, 5 seasoned captains, and Colonel Khan, legend of the fighter corps. It was the happiest moment of my life standing on the flight deck, with him pinning the wings on my shoulder. Stamp of the Union's approval. I would have branded it into my flesh if they'd asked me. Our shakedown cruise was out in Harmony Reach, out beyond the ring colonies, where there are plenty of small, unregistered settlements, and plenty of smuggling between them and the Union. Intoxicants, weapons, outlawed cyber mods. There wasn't much in the way of civilization in Harmony Reach. They needed manufactured goods from the Union, and they'd sell their own mother to get them. Most patrols were single echelon, 10 lieutenants and a captain, scanning a planet or an asteroid field for illegal traders. We found plenty of them. Most of the time, they didn't even try to run, but a few gave us a chance to test out the void sabers. A warning shot was usually enough to get them to see sense. 4 plasma cannons are hard to ignore, but there were some who thought they could outrun us. 1 or 2 actually could. I suppose you don't stay in business as a smuggler if you're not slippery, and some of the ships had modifications that the Union's designers would have loved to take a look at. But most of the time, the chase ended when we shot out their engines. It became a competition to see if we could take out the propulsion without damaging the rest of the ship. Most of the time we managed it. Not always, but mostly. The carrier we were operating from would have preferred it if we didn't fill up their hangar bays with junk, but you can't ask a fighter pilot to do sloppy work just because it would be more convenient for you. It was a point of pride. We didn't even think about all the smugglers who ended up in the brig instead of scattered in bits across empty space. The Navy would have preferred it if we'd saved them the trouble of organising a trial as well, but we were pilots, not executioners. Or so we thought. The carrier group looped around our area of operations, striking out into Harmony Reach, then arcing back around to resupply in the rim colonies. And while the fleet was restocking, we got shore leave. If you've heard anything about the rim colonies, you've heard they're rough places. Whatever you've heard isn't the half of it. I had a great deal of respect for pioneers, terraforming new worlds and building new societies with nothing but sweat and determination. But it takes a certain sort of person to volunteer for a life like that, and trawling through the bars of the spaceport, I saw a parade of every kind of scumbag the Union has to offer. You only ended up in the rim colonies if you had nowhere else to go. The locals kept clear of us, for the most part. Whenever a group of pilots entered a bar, everyone would suddenly be interested in their own drink and nothing else, and a few customers would slip out the back. We thought it was because they took one look at us and knew we could handle ourselves in a fight. That was what military training was for, after all. Only if one of the locals was very drunk would they tell us what they thought of us. It wasn't flattering. You'd have thought they'd be a bit more grateful to the people keeping them safe, but no. Still, who cares what a handful of bitter old alcoholics think, right? Through a pilot's visor, we all looked like heroes, and that was what mattered. It was on the, 4th or 5th resupply stop that we ended up in a bar just as the local garrison was changing shifts. A dozen of the spaceport's Union security personnel walked straight up to the counter, and anyone sitting there who wasn't already gone got hauled out of their seat and told to beat it. One of them got sucker punched in the stomach for being too slow, but we were having a good time so we barely noticed. A few drinks in, and the soldiers were starting fights with anyone who so much as looked at them funny, and soon there was barely anyone else in the bar except us. When I went to get the next round of drinks, I told the barman he should call station security and get them thrown out. He just looked at me like I'd threatened to kill his wife and children. Confusion, mixed with abject terror. I was too drunk to draw any conclusions from this, but I let it drop. The soldiers broke half the furniture in the joint, then left without paying their tab. We were off the station the next morning. I really think that immediately after, the only thing any of us took away from that night was a reinforced sense that we were the elite of the Union military. Several cuts above the local garrisons, who were clearly poorly disciplined amateurs. Anything that didn't impact our overinflated egos, we didn't even notice. The civilians who had to deal with these jerks every day, what did they matter? That was what military training was for, after all. It was a few weeks after that, and we were heading back towards the rim colonies again, this time to Halstead's World, a mostly agricultural colony. There had been reports of smugglers attacking local patrol craft, and we were running patrols constantly as we approached the colony. My echelon was out at the edge of the solar system, scanning the remote asteroids. We were spread out, too far apart to help each other, but we weren't expecting trouble. There was no sign of life out here. We were just covering our bases. Then I picked up something on my radar. A small dot broke away from the asteroid I was approaching. At first I thought it was a geyser. Some asteroids periodically vent debris as the ice inside them is heated and cooled. Then I saw the IR signature of an engine flare. I ramped up power to the engines, and as the G-forces pushed me back in my seat, I toggled the safeties on my weapons. My comms were open. The rest of my echelon knew where I was, but they wouldn't reach me before I made contact with the unknown ship. It wasn't fast. I caught up to it easily, but I was in a state-of-the-art fighter, and the ship I was chasing was a passenger vessel. 5 decks, less than 200 meters long. The sort of ship that's mostly used as an in-system ferry, but occasionally gets outfitted with a hyperdrive. I fired a warning shot. It accelerated. It was no match for a Void Sabre, of course. Its engines were embedded well into the superstructure, a safety feature, sacrificing cooling for protection, except in this case it made it harder for me to target them without blowing the whole ship up. I gunned my engines and came right up alongside it. There were no weapons visible, and I figured if it had anything hidden away it would have used them rather than trying to run. I thought I just had to get their attention, make it clear they couldn't escape, so I positioned myself only a few meters off their starboard side. I could see right into the ship. Passenger ships are built for comfort and enjoyment, so there were windows all along the hull. I was expecting to see row after row of empty seats, with whatever they were smuggling packed away in the cargo hold. Instead, I saw it was full of people, men, women, and children, looking at me wide-eyed. It was still accelerating, and my sensors showed that it was spooling up its engines to go into hyperspace. My ship was relaying all this data to the carrier and Squadron Command. The captain of my echelon, Dax McCain, told me to disable the fleeing ship. I replied that I couldn't. There were civilians on board and I risked destroying the ship if I fired on it. He told me I had to try it anyway. We argued back and forth for a moment. He was sympathetic, but orders were orders. We were there to take down any illegal shipping. 3, maybe 4 times I refused to open fire. Then Colonel Khan himself came on the comm. I explained to him that it was a passenger ship, not a smuggler, and it was full of civilians. Didn't matter. Colonel Khan was adamant and completely unsympathetic. We didn't know that it wasn't carrying illegal goods in its cargo hold. Even if it wasn't, it was an unregistered ship carrying unlicensed travellers. They were breaking Union law, and if they wouldn't surrender, then they deserved what they got. He ordered me to open fire, gave me a direct order. I punched the accelerator again and darted out ahead of the passenger ship. It wouldn't be long before it entered hyperspace. I had to get them to stop now. I put myself right in front of them, turned, and fired a warning shot so close to their bridge that it probably scorched the paintwork. They still didn't stop. Colonel Khan came through, and again he ordered me to take the shot. There was a dangerous growl in his voice. I let the passenger ship pass by me, then positioned myself directly behind its engines. Sublight drives were powering down, ready for the jump to hyperspace. No sound from the engines. No sound from the ship. I couldn't hear the children screaming in fear. You're always alone in space. All I could hear, over and over again, was Colonel Khan roaring at me, "Take the shot! Take the shot! Take the shot!" And I did as I was ordered. That was what military training was for, after all. I lined up my shot as carefully as I ever had, aiming for their hyperdrive only, and I fired. And just as I'd feared it would, the plasma bolt sliced through the ship and hit something vital. The passenger ship came apart in a rippling wave of internal explosions. There wasn't even enough left afterwards to tell us for sure how many had died, but it was definitely hundreds. Hundreds of men, women, and children. I'd finally made a real difference. When we got back to the carrier, Dax told me that Colonel Khan had decided to overlook my borderline insubordination. It was a difficult situation, but I got the job done. I just stared straight through him. So he took me to the mess hall, and he leaned on the cooks until they gave us the home-brewed stuff that the officers aren't meant to know about. 3 drinks in, I asked him, "Is this how you live with yourself?" "Better than the alternative," he answered, "because the only way to really live with yourself was to become the mindless drone the Union wanted you to be. To believe that whatever you were ordered to do was right, because it was the Union telling you to do it. Compared to that, alcoholism was practically healthy." I'd like to say I turned against the Union right there and then, decided to get out of the military no matter what it took. But if I was that sort of person, I'd have told Colonel Khan to go to hell and let the passenger ship escape. I still believed in loyalty, sacrifice, duty, and I couldn't quite let go of what they'd told me those words meant. So I did exactly what Dax had warned me against, and decided it wasn't my place to question orders. If my superiors decided something was necessary, then they knew better than me. And yet, I still felt queasy when they pinned the ribbon to my chest at the end of the tour. Our anti-smuggling operations had been a great success. Over 100 ships captured or destroyed. They didn't even mention the casualties. We hadn't taken any, so as far as they were concerned, there hadn't been any. They gave us a few months in the core territories before we were moved on to the active roster again. We'd passed our first test with flying colours as far as they were concerned, and justified the decision to give the best ships they had to the greenest pilots, but they still didn't want to risk giving us too much too soon. So we got to spend a few weeks on New Dakota, sunning ourselves on the beaches and wiping out in the surf. Then we got assigned to a new carrier, and a whole new fleet. Muster point was Earth orbit, and for the first time in years I got to go home. My parents were just happy to see me home safe. My older sisters wanted to show me off to their friends, and my nieces and nephews wanted stories of my heroics. Suddenly, I found it hard to talk to them. Every time I looked at them, I saw the wide-eyed faces staring out of the windows of that passenger ship. We did 2 more anti-smuggling tours. More arrests, more shoot-downs, more things we just had to find ways to ignore. Then a few months back at the academy, teaching the newest class all the tricks to piloting the Void Sabres. They were only 2 years younger than us, and it felt like we were babysitting a bunch of kids. After that, we were given shore leave on Brandenburg, then shipped out for the Rim colonies again, this time on the other side of the Union. Instead of Harmony Reach, we'd be operating in the Magellan cluster. This was a rougher patch of space in both senses of the term. Nebulae and gravitational distortions made it difficult and dangerous for ships to operate there. Naval cruisers had a tough time out there, so more of the patrol work was done by fighters. And because it was a difficult place for the Navy to operate in, it attracted what the briefings called the criminal element. Not just illegal mining and smuggling trying to stay out of sight, but pirates who would actively attack Union shipping. Pirate activity had been increasing in recent years, and losses had started to mount. The Union was deploying more naval assets to the area to clamp down on the border regions before they got totally out of control. We were the best of the best, so we were being sent out there to hunt down as many pirates as we could find. We were going to make a difference. They said those exact words in the briefing, and I felt nauseous for a moment, until I pushed it down again. The first thing we found out when we got out to the colonies nearest the cluster was that the briefings had hugely downplayed the level of pirates' attacks in the region. There were several other naval task forces already operating out there, and some of their squadrons had taken as much as 30% casualties. Hit-and-run attacks, a huge rise on even just a few years ago. The local system defense forces had taken just as much for a beating. Some of them were barely functional anymore. The second thing? Well, it took us a while to find out what else was wrong. At first we were way too busy. They threw us right into a major expedition into the cluster. 2 fleets, a dozen capital ships, more than 20 escorts and 5 squadrons of fighters, although all except ours were still using star spears. Intel had provided the location of a pirate base, and now our fleet had arrived, they reckoned they finally had enough forces to launch a full-scale assault on it, without stripping the border defences bare. We went at it head-on, punching straight through the unmanned weapon platforms that served as the base's first line of defence. Then we slowed right down. The base was in a thicker patch of nebula, and if you weren't careful, your own momentum would sandblast your hull down to paper. So the larger ships hung back, and all 5 squadrons of fighters advanced in one big wave. We were met by hundreds of pirate fighter craft. One moment we were looking at nothing but dust, and the next we were surrounded by small ships and fighting for our lives. That was how the first real battle I ever fought in began. They were good. They were using a mix of star spears and the older Shadow Shark fighters, but they modded them heavily with a whole range of upgrades, and their pilots knew what they were doing. They must have taken part in the attacks on Union space, because they had clearly fought Union ships before. They knew Union tactics, and they knew the capabilities of our fighters. But only for the squadrons using star spears. They'd never fought the Void Sabers before, and they never fought us. It was still fiery mayhem for a while, but slowly we managed to claw out an advantage and start whittling them down. They'd break and melt back into the clouds only to come back at us again while we were catching our breath. But we took out fighter after fighter, and eventually they couldn't hold us back any longer. We finally broke through and they scattered. We lost 10 fighters. 6 pilots managed to eject, but 4 killed in one engagement was still a heavy blow for a squadron that had, until that point, only lost 2 pilots to accidents in 3 years of operation. Lansing, Michaels, Krasinski and Sousa. Sarah Krasinski and I had dated for a few months, before I decided I didn't need the complications. I saw her Void Saber come apart under a hell of enemy plasma. When the battle was over, we found what they'd been defending. It was more than just a pirate base, it was a whole colony. A small city built on a planet hidden in the midst of the nebula. It was incredibly Spartan, but it had all the basic amenities. There was even a school. I walked through the classrooms with bright crayon scribblings on the exposed concrete walls, and wondered to myself who the hell would want to live out here. Why would anyone leave the Union just to live like this? I never got the chance to ask any of the residents, because it was completely empty when we got there. They must have known we were coming. Which begged the question, why had they put up such a fight for it? Well, half the answer was maybe that they were hoping that they might somehow be able to keep us from capturing their home. They might have stood a chance if we brought 1 squadron less, but we found out the other half of the answer when we got back to their own colonies. Turned out, the top brass hadn't left enough forces behind to guard the border after all. While we had been busy attacking an empty settlement, the pirates had launched a major assault on fleet headquarters for the region. An orbital space station, above a colony with the imaginative name of Landfall, and the space dock and storage facilities that went with it. The pirates had taken heavy casualties for their audacious gamble, but maybe 40% of the Third Fleet was scrap metal drifting around the system, and the rest of it was shot up to hell and back. That meant we weren't going anywhere for a while. With the Third Fleet rendered combat ineffective, we were reduced to garrison duty. On our previous tours we'd visited a lot of the rim colonies, but we'd never stayed longer than it took to resupply. A few days, then we were out into deep space again to hunt down the bad guys. This time, we got to see what life was actually like out on the rim. And it was harsh. Maybe not as bad as the pirate colony we captured, but there wasn't much in the way of creature comforts. And what little the people there had, they had to work hard for. Long hours, horrific conditions, meager pay. And yeah, a lot of the colonists were scumbags who volunteered to settle new worlds because they couldn't make it elsewhere in the Union. But the longer we were there, the harder it was not to notice that there were also a lot of colonists who were just regular people. Regular families. They avoided us at first just like we avoided them, but spend enough time sharing the same space, and eventually someone will strike up a conversation. And the first question I asked was, how do you end up all the way out here? Turned out, the Union had really been stretching the definition of the word volunteer lately. Then finally, at long last, I really started looking into what I'd been fighting for these past 3 years. It was hard to do that at first because all the material on the open net was disseminated by the Union. There was no censorship, as such, but any site critical of the government was quickly flooded with bots to the point where it became unusable. The part that really shocked me, though, was that none of the facts were really secrets. It was just the way they were presented that was carefully controlled. Read the official narratives, and the Rim colonies were economic success stories that offered new opportunities to the poor and gave criminals a chance to reform. Read between the lines and talk to the people who lived there, and a different story emerged. Very few people thought to do that, though. That was what they relied on, that the vast majority would be too complacent to look. And when I finally realized what was going on, I was ashamed it had taken me so long. It started out honestly enough. The Union organised terraforming projects, and in the early days they paid well to attract settlers out to the Rim, or they at least gave them the equipment to build themselves a real life on a rich and productive land. But as expansion accelerated, corners were cut. There weren't the resources to fund that many projects at once, and as conditions worsened, it became harder and harder to find settlers. But the Union needed the colonies to keep growing. It relied on the raw materials they shipped back, so the government had to find settlers somewhere. At first, they offered criminals a chance to go to the colonies as a legitimate route to redemption. Then, when they couldn't find enough prisoners willing to leave their old lives behind, they started pressuring them, upping their sentences for minor infractions and reducing their privileges until they agreed to go. Some people complained, but it was too lucrative to stop. They were both solving their settlement problem and emptying their expensive, overcrowded prisons. Eventually, even that wasn't enough. They ran out of genuine convicts, and they couldn't afford to stop because the Rim colonies were underpinning the whole Union economy by that point. So they just decided to make more crimes. Previously, only serious crimes were considered eligible for the transportation program. These days you could get shipped out to the mines or the factories for just about anything, provided you were too poor to afford a decent lawyer. Petty theft, failing to insure your vehicle, a tax arrears. And when all else failed, there was always the catch-all charge of vagrancy, or in other words, being too poor for the gleaming cities of the core territories. Technically, most sentences were short, but even if you served out your prison term in a year or two, parole always came with the condition that you weren't allowed to leave your colony without the parole board's permission, and they never gave permission. Which meant that your two choices were either to find work in one of the industries that made the colonies so very profitable for everyone but the people living in them, or starve. The major employers could treat their workers how they liked, and they knew it. Ex-cons had no choice but to work for them no matter the wages or the conditions, and if they ever stepped out of line then the Union military was there to back them up, with all necessary force. And sometimes a little more than that, if the local thugs wearing Union uniforms felt like it. It was indentured servitude in all but name. There was no way for the people in the Rim colonies to fight back, and no way for them to go home again. But there was a third option: leave the Union entirely. For decades now, there have been a steady trickle of people striking out beyond the Rim, into regions like Harmony Reach and the Magellan Cluster, to escape the Union's control. Life was still harsh out there, but at least they were free. The Union wasn't happy about that. They hated losing their labour force, and nothing frightened the government more than the thought of smugglers shipping enough weapons to the Rim colonies for a full-scale uprising. So they've been cracking down more and more in recent years. And in response, the scattered settlements out beyond the Rim had started banding together for protection, pooling their resources to build fleets that could defend them from Union attacks, and even strike back and disrupt naval operations in the Rim colonies. We weren't fighting pirates. We were fighting rebels. It took me a long time to draw all that out of the locals. They were suspicious of anyone wearing a uniform, for obvious reasons, but slowly I built up the trust of a couple of people on landfall who were willing to take a risk on a young pilot with more questions than sense. And they were able to put me in touch with people who could tell me even more. The rebels had mostly come from the rim colonies after all. They knew how to get their people in, and how to hide them so they wouldn't be found. The hardest part wasn't finding the information, and it wasn't making contact with the rebels. It was pretending that I was still the same shithead kid, who'd murdered hundreds of men, women, and children, just because someone with more bars on their uniform had told me to. Because I hated that kid now. More than the Union, more than Colonel Khan or any of the other officers, I hated him with a burning passion that could have outshone a supernova. It helped, a little, that I knew I wasn't the only member of Raven's squadron who had that problem. 3 years earlier, Dax McCain had told me that alcoholism was the better way to deal with it. I wondered what he'd say if I told him I had a third option. I also wondered who else he'd given that advice to. Talking to Dax was like trying to dance blindfolded, each of us feeling the other out, not wanting to say anything dangerous before we were sure the other could be trusted. But eventually, we came to an understanding. I knew exactly why he drank so much, and he knew more than a couple of people who felt the same way. In fact, while I'd been cruising along, oblivious to everything but my own misery, Dax had been busy. He was a captain, after all. It was his job to know the pilots he was responsible for, and he knew that a lot of them weren't happy. I was on the deeper end of the spectrum of disgust, but most of the squadron could feel that there was something wrong. It used to be that the Union would mix new recruits with seasoned veterans who weren't just experienced, but reliable. If you're a young person with no life experience, and you get posted with a bunch of fanatics bound up in the fantasy of military brotherhood, where it's the squad versus the rest of the universe, pretty soon their opinions will become your opinions. But they hadn't done that with Raven's squadron. They'd chosen to build the best fighting unit they could, and rely on Colonel Khan to see to our morale. That hadn't worked. We were young, and goddamn we were stupid, but we weren't blind. I wasn't the only one who'd been asking questions. No one had asked quite so many questions as me, though. So far, Dax had told people to shut up and keep their doubts to themselves. The only thing he felt he could do was protect his people. But when I started talking about other options, he didn't tell me to shut up. He listened. And then we talked to other people, who talked to other people. Nothing happened because we were risking our necks and we had to be careful. But we built up a picture of who thought what. And it turned out we were safer than we thought. It wouldn't take that much more for the squadron to reach breaking point. The final straw on the camel's back came sooner than we thought. The miners on the northern continent of landfall went on strike and blockaded the roads with their massive excavators. The strikebreakers were sent in, but were driven off with a combination of improvised weapons and the fact that all the mining vehicles were built like tanks anyway. Then the colony's government called on the Union military to help, and the fleet commanders. They ordered us to do strafing runs on the picket lines to break them up. Colonel Khan personally ordered us to take out every terrorist on the ground we could see. We'd have got replacements by that point, for the ships and pilots we'd lost in the Battle of the Nebula, Void Sabres with even more upgrades, and a couple of pilots fresh out of the academy. The same kids we'd trained on the Void Sabres before shipping out to the Magellan cluster. I felt sorry for them. They didn't have the burden of our sins. They were innocent, and they were being forced to choose between their lives and their souls. But they worshipped the ground we walked on. I had my qualms about it. We were leading them into serious danger after all. But if the Union could use loyalty to get its soldiers to do the wrong thing, it seemed only fair for it to nudge someone into doing the right thing. the newbies were with us. In fact, by that point the only members of Raven Squadron who weren't with us were two of the captains, and of course Colonel Khan himself. Half the squadron wanted to mutiny right there and then. Hunting down smugglers and pirates they could just about justify to themselves, but shooting down miners who just wanted enough to feed their families? They crossed too many lines already. They weren't going to take a step further. They'd refuse the order point blank and take whatever came next, whether it was prison or a firing squad. The rest either wanted to run or were waiting to see what everyone else would do. I suggested another option. We went on the mission, as the colonial government and Colonel Khan had ordered, and we fired on the picket lines, as ordered. And my God, what a sight it was as our plasma cannons tore up machines that must have weighed 500 tons or more. Only we knew that the miners weren't in those machines anymore. I'd made contact with the rebels, and the rebels had made contact with the miners, and they'd worked out a deal. The miners would let us break up the strike, and the rebels would make it worth their while. The colonial government was pleased. The Union government was pleased. And Colonel Khan was very pleased that his experimental squadron was working out so well. Everyone was so pleased, in fact, that it wasn't long before they sent us out into the Magellan cluster again. They'd finally scraped together enough forces to garrison the nearest rim colonies again, properly this time, which freed up another 2 fleets to strike more of the pirate bases. And that included us. This time, Union intelligence took secrecy seriously. They'd finally figured out the rebels had spies all over the rim. No civilian vessels were allowed anywhere near us as we left space dock, and mustered for the attack in the cluster. They carefully searched every ship leaving the system, and censored any reference to fleet movements. In fact, the only way the rebels could possibly get advance warning this time would be if they had someone actually inside the fleet, which wasn't possible, of course. Yet somehow, incredibly, when we reached our destination, we found the enemy there waiting for us. As before, 5 Union squadrons advanced into the nebula. But this time, a lot more than enemy fighters suddenly appeared out of the dust. A whole battle fleet. Who the hell knew where they got all the ships? They probably had to bring together every rebel ship they could get their hands on. But they outnumbered and outgunned the Union fleet. The wave of fighters stopped in its tracks. Most of it did, that is. One squadron kept going, charging into the proverbial valley of death. Can you guess which one it was? We all heard Colonel Khan open up the comm channel. Dax put it on speaker for us all to hear. The colonel was on the carrier rather than in the Sable with us. Maybe he just wanted to be in the command center, but maybe he suspected something. He told us to pull back. Don't try to be a hero, there's too many of them, he said. 2 of the captains were also screaming at us to get back to the fleet, but for some reason, at that very moment, their ships experienced 3 simultaneous malfunctions that left them adrift, without comms, and unable to do anything about it. When the colonel didn't get a response, he ordered us to turn around and head back to the carrier, and when we still ignored him, he started to get really angry, shouting at us, demanding to know what the hell we thought we were doing. Dax actually answered him then. The right thing, for once. At the moment we entered weapons range, there was a part of me that was worried the rebels hadn't got my full message, or didn't trust it, and we were about to be obliterated. But they let us glide right on through their formation, and take up station alongside them. The 2 fleets held each other at standoff for a while, but eventually the Union fleet withdrew. They knew they didn't have the muscle to settle this today, and the rebels let them go, because even if they won the battle today, they'd lose a lot of ships in a straight-up fight like this, and tomorrow the Union would send another fleet. We defected to the rebels without even firing a shot. It's been 2 years since then. We joined the fight to keep the free colonies free, and extend that right to the rim colonies as well. We fought a lot of battles, some that went well for us, and some that went badly. But more often than not, we beat whatever they could throw at us. We're the best of the best, after all. We've proven that, finally. Not because we passed an exam, or because we got a fancy pin on our uniforms. Because we've got a cause that's actually worth fighting for now. Oh, and because we can still outshoot, outfly, and outthink any pilot from here to Harmony Reach. We've had more Union defectors join us since we left, and they say the whole fighter corps is scared to go up against us. They'll flinch if someone even mentions our name. We aren't known as Raven Squadron anymore, by the way. They call us Rebel Squadron. But the Union is still standing strong. However this war ends, it's not going to happen anytime soon. So what does it mean to make a difference? When the Union is still around, does everything we walked away from, all the sacrifices we made, all the friends we've lost, does it even matter? After all these years of war, I think I can finally answer that. Because what that kid who signed up for the academy didn't understand was that it doesn't have to be a big difference to be an important one. Doing the right thing always makes a difference.